heard the conventional view. Now prepare yourself to hear the other side. High school teachers Mike Margison and Justin Spears bring you the alternative view you didn't get in the classroom. Now here they are, Margison and Spears.
Yep, back with you once again on a Wednesday evening here. Come to you live, yet again, another episode of The Other Side. For our listeners, get you our contact information as always here. There are many, many different ways in which you can take this show on. We're glad to be able to present to you this show in many different formats, so hopefully you can find one that fits best for you. Welcome to our listeners, as always, Saturday mornings on WCVLAM.com, 1550 92.1 out of Crawfordsville, rebroadcast Saturday mornings at 8 a.m. If you're catching us on there, welcome to The Other Side. You can hear this show live, usually on Wednesday nights, 9 o'clock on our YouTube channel. That's Mike, Justin. You can search The Other Side and find the podcast there with all of our previous episodes catalog that you can go back and listen to. And there's many, many mobile platforms as well. We are on Spreaker. The Spreaker app is an app that you can get in both iTunes and Google Play. You can search for the show The Other Side with Margison and Spears. You can favorite that or bookmark that, and then you will get updates when we post new shows on there. Usually try to post those kind of a week behind as I work on the schedule with 92.1 and 1550 WCVL out there. You can catch us on iTunes now. We are active on iTunes. We're also active on Google Play. If you look through podcasts on Google Play, both of those you can search for The Other Side with Margison and Spears and get us there as well. And then all of our social media, The Other Side accounts on Facebook at TOS Podcast, on Twitter at TOS_podcast. You can get us there. And of course, our personal accounts. And we always encourage contact through email. That's Margison and Spears, all one word, MARGESON and Spears at gmail.com. So that kind of takes care of all of the contact information here. I want to welcome in the other half of The Other Side, Mike Margison. Mike, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing well. Ready to talk about Joe McCarthy.
Yeah, fantastic. I know for those of you that stuck around last week and listened to us, we teased this a little bit at the end of our regular episode. And then when we went on our bonus time on YouTube, we always do about a 15-minute bonus session after we finish our 30-minute time slot for radio. We definitely went ahead and told you guys that what we were going to be covering tonight was Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism and the Red Scare. And, you know, it's really just an interesting time in the country during this period of time. There's a lot going on coming out of World War II and what sets up in Russia and the second Red Scare. And so what we're going to do here tonight is, as we always try to do on The Other Side, you know, if you were to look through any standard textbook and look at history textbook and look at McCarthyism, you're going to see a side, right, presented. And, you know, Mike, just, you know, kind of play along here for a second. What might that scenario be? What might you be hearing about McCarthyism as you would open up a standard textbook and read about it?
Well, I'll just go ahead and speak for what I learned when I learned about McCarthyism. So, I mean, this fairly standard narrative is that this was a kind of wild-eyed lunatic senator from Wisconsin who was playing on people's fears at the beginning of the Cold War in the 1950s. He was essentially pointing out anybody and everybody as being a communist, and these were completely baseless accusations. He was cruel, he was vindictive, and I think the kind of culminating part of that story is the Army McCarthy hearings when, what was that lawyer's name? Welch said, "At long last, Senator, have you no decency?" And that's kind of the story. So there's just this obscure dude from Wisconsin who got his 15 minutes of fame and used it to make these wild, baseless accusations against people, and died. A couple of years later. He was broke, an alcoholic. I think that's pretty much what you get in the textbook. I brought home our textbook from school. It's effectively what it says.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's pretty much head on. That's kind of what I had read through in the little bit that I had read through in our history textbook, as you described it there. And so, what we always try to do here is present, a little bit of either as the show is called, the other side, or just some things that maybe the textbooks either flat out get wrong, or in my case tonight, the section that they really leave out here, I think is really important. And that's what I'm going to be focusing in on here at the start. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes and walk our listeners through maybe some questions that if you were to read about McCarthyism, whether it be through a textbook or, just Google it and look for it online, maybe these are the types of things that you're not going to find. I had to dig. I had to dig pretty hard to find this stuff here. And I spent probably a good 3 or 4 hours of time throughout the week here, piecemealing this together. And then I kind of hit on 2 different things that I really thought, man, this is it. This is what I've been looking for. And so as I was reading and kind of digesting what Mike just laid out for you there on McCarthyism, the question that kept coming to my mind is, where did McCarthy, as a senator, get the authority to run this commission to start questioning people, start trying to dig for and root out communism in the government? And that's kind of really what it started out as. But as he kind of explained, and it grew larger and larger, eventually you start seeing, pretty much civilians that are brought in and questioned on their activities and things of that nature. And I really, and I want to be very clear with this, I am not an expert in this. I have, this is not an era of U.S. history that I have spent a lot of time studying. I know kind of the basic facts about, what went on post-World War II. But I really had to dig and learn a lot about this. And I felt like I grew a lot as I, went through this process of learning more about this. And so, as I said, the one question that kept coming up to me was, where does he get this authority to do this? And what do these commissions look like? Because as I was reading about the line of questioning, it's never presented in the textbook as to where this authority comes from. To me, this seems like if somebody is breaking a law, if somebody is committing an act that would be considered treason, right, which would be to try to overthrow the government or, obviously put anybody in any danger with activities that would be violent in any nature, as, sometimes protests could become damaging of property or things those are criminal, right, or civil issues that would go into the court system. So where is it that the Congress, right, the legislative part of our government gets off on being able to essentially question people in the line in which a court would, right? And to be able to, in effect, render decisions and verdicts on these people that really had a profound and deep impact on their lives. And it really ruined the lives of a lot of people here. And so I went back and started looking here, and this is, as we've talked about in numerous different occasions, an implied or inherent power that gets created. That's a very key word there, created. This is not something that if you were to read through Article 1 of the Constitution, you would see clearly defined that, hey, Congress has the authority to create committees to be able to question people on various different things in their lives, right? There's nothing expressly granted to Congress to be able to do this. So you might be thinking or questioning, well, then how were they able to do it? Well, what they were able to do is they said, okay, if something's going to tie into the legislative process, then it's inherent in there or implied in there that we being Congress, have the authority to be able to regulate that. So in a real roundabout way, and really where this, I believe, if I remember the history of this correctly, got its roots from, was there was a colonel or a general or somebody in the Army that had lost a battle way back, I believe, in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And I'm going to link, by the way, to a couple of websites that I used here I'm going to start creating a show notes page so that our listeners can follow up on the resources that we use in putting these shows together, so that you can find where we got this information from. And it was actually back in 1792. It was asserted by the House of Representatives when it appointed a committee to investigate the defeat of General St. Clair and his army by the Indians in the Northwest, and empowered the Congress to, quote, call for such persons, papers, and records as may be necessary to assist their inquiries. And again, what this related back to was their ability in the legislative process. If something, they needed some information, if they needed to question people or try to ask, anything related to what a piece of legislation may deal with, they could call you into a committee and question you. And so this initially is very, very narrowly interpreted to just people related to the government, right? Because you would think that that's pretty much who's involved in the legislative process are people within the government. Well, as you fast forward, and as you know, once the government gets a power, first off, it's never going to give that power up. Second, what it's going to do is it's going to look for ways to expand that power. So as history goes on and we go throughout the Civil War and on into the early 1900s, again, we see an increasing amount of pressure by Congress creating committees and subcommittees in pulling in different groups of people and question them, interrogating them in these committees. And they would justify it again by saying this is a part of the legislative process. So we need to be able to know, hey, what is it that you are doing over here? There was a famous court case where the government had invested money with a man, I believe in a real estate firm, and the firm went bankrupt. And a couple of senators got together and said, hey, we want to know where this money went. So they subpoena this guy, or they call him in and they interrogate him. And he basically says, I don't have to answer your questions. And so now we've got a legal showdown. So this is where we enter in and bring in the court system, right? And I've always found it fascinating that we tout our three branches of government as being co-equal, separation of powers, checks and balances. Yet when the federal government is going to rule on action that the federal government has taken, what are the odds that they're going to look at themselves and say, yeah, we probably overstepped our boundaries here? Now, I'm not saying it doesn't ever happen, but what I am saying, and I looked really, really hard this week and I could not find anything. So if anybody out there can help me, I tried digging through looking for the U.S., the federal government's record just in the Supreme Court. What is its record? What is its odds, its probability, its likelihood of winning a case in the Supreme Court? And I could not find anything anywhere, but I'm willing to bet that their odds are pretty good. So you've got the federal government and you've got the legislative branch and the Supreme Court kind of working in cahoots and in tandem. Now, again, this isn't to say that judges haven't ever really smacked down the legislative branch or told them, hey, you're overstepping your boundaries here. But by and large with this one, it had grown dramatically over time. And there was a particular phrase that was used here in kind of setting up and giving this more power as we fast forward and talk a little bit about McCarthyism. And what this boiled down to was a clause known as the bounds of power and pertinency. And this was used several times in a piece that was written back in 1954 about McCarthy. And basically, it was a article written in the New Republic where the writer was questioning what's Eisenhower's role in checking a senator, right? He's asking this question, like, how do the legislative and the executive branches work here? And essentially, my understanding was, Eisenhower was saying, look, this is an internal issue in the Congress, right? Is so long as he's not, doing anything breaking the law, they have rules and things to keep their house in order. And, we have to abide by those. Well, as you can tell by the way that McCarthy started going after people, and you can read person after person, and it just increasingly grew more and more. I always kind of think of it as like this witch hunt, as you talked about. Again, he's using and playing off of this increasing expanded power where it's been interpreted not only to apply to government officials, but now to citizens alike. And the thing that I found as I start to wrap this up here that is so telling in here is that when you get into these subcommittees, and if you go back and read any of the transcripts from McCarthy and the way that he went through and treated people, you essentially forfeit all of your constitutional rights when you're in front of a congressional committee. And this article talks about how many constitutional rights were violated in these committees, whether it be lack of representation or trying to plead the fifth or using First Amendment rights to speech, and just all kinds of different things that were just blatantly overlooked and stepped on and trampled upon. And again, it was kind of one of these things where nobody really had the silver bullet or the spine to stand up to McCarthy and what he was doing. And so as I conclude and wrap this up, when you go through and you read the methods, the tactics, the strategies, whether you agree with what it started off as, the goal being to root communism out of the government, to shutting down communist voices in this country, I think, as I've always said before in many other episodes, we've got to go back and look at previous precedent, and we've got to look at what does it mean when we give the government this power to do this, and where did this come from? You always have to be on your toes with the federal government and be looking for that. So I thought that was fascinating to look through and read about as I understood this phenomenon of McCarthyism and this epic witch hunt that went on. So I think that's a really important thing. Now, Mike, before we jump into your part here, I want to read through with our listeners here. We always appreciate the support that we get, and we are supported by Common Sense Products. And if you've been listening to the show, we've talked a little bit about this, that there are over 230 million cars and trucks on U.S. roads today, and that most car owners believe they should change their oil about every 3,000 miles. I know I used to think that. But you know what? Oil doesn't wear out. It becomes contaminated. Most popular brand oil filters are effective down to 30 microns at best. Many major oil companies are selling recycled motor oil today. That's used oil. They're reselling it. Oil doesn't wear out, guys. Super filter your oil with the 1 micron filtering system. The poly filter is easy to use and can be used for many, many years. The kit you get will include 2 washable filters and what to watch for in used oil, where to find oil, and how to market filtered oil to others if you wish. Now, look, all you have to do is send $20 cash, check, or money order to Common Sense Products, P.O. Box 172, New Richmond, Indiana, 47967. Look, tax and shipping are paid for. Again, all you have to do, send $20 cash, check, or money order to Common Sense Products, P.O. Box 172, New Richmond, Indiana, 47967. And again, thank you to Common Sense for your support of the other side. So again, Mike, having gotten that there, let's kick it over to you. Talk to us a little bit about the way that history remembers McCarthy.
Well, first of all, I want to say great take on, for those listening, Justin and I we really don't do a whole lot of pre-planning, especially now in spring break when we don't see each other. But that was a good take. And I tell you what, if the textbook take on McCarthy was that it represented an abuse of government power, I'd be all for it. That's not exactly the angle that they take, but I enjoyed listening to what you said there. I'm going to go back. I'm going to talk about the way that McCarthy is typically taught and the way that I learned it, and then do a little bit of follow-up. Is that the entire story, or is there in fact another side? Well, this book that I have in front of me, this is our standard 11th grade U.S. history textbook. And when it gets into this section, one of the things I did last week was I just read the headings of each of the sections, so you can kind of get a feel for what this is going to sound like. But first major heading here is McCarthy uses ruthless tactics. McCarthy makes accusations. McCarthy's power increases. And then it finishes off here with McCarthy's call from power. So as you can see, it's kind of built up like this is a guy who, power hungry. And the story essentially is he is going after communists and he is not letting anything get in his way here. So he's going to trample over anybody and everybody on his way to root out communists. And people may have heard, if they remember this from U.S. history, that he did a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, and he was holding up a piece of paper, and there was, nothing that anybody could see, but he was saying, I have in my hand the names of 57 card-carrying communists. And then in another speech, he said, I have 205 communists working at the State Department. And then apparently the number kept changing, kind of from speech to speech. And people were asking him, do you have any names? Can you tell us anybody specifically? And he wasn't able to come up with any names. And, this kind of went on. And everybody that he brought in front of him denied it and, asked for hard proof, and which was difficult for him to come by. And as I said, eventually he had called out the Army for having some lax security. And there were these televised hearings, the Army McCarthy hearings. And that's when the Army's lawyer, Jack Welch, said, sir, at long last have you no decency. And that kind of spelled the end for McCarthy. I'm going to read what they said here about him, but what did they call him? An unscrupulous man, clever and unscrupulous man, began to take, advantage of this sense of fear and helplessness of many Americans. So really, he's painted as a bad guy. And I got to be honest, if I had known Joe McCarthy, or if I had met him, or if I knew him now, doesn't really sound like somebody that I would be friends with. However, the one question that needs to be asked here, I think, is anything that he did correct? Was he right in all of this? And that is something that is not addressed here in this history book. Now, you cannot teach McCarthyism if you are not going to teach the Venona Project. And what the Venona Project was a top secret, I think it was started by it was within the Army. And the goal of the Venona Project was to intercept Soviet cables and decode them. And in the mid-1940s, so this began towards the end of World War II, and in the mid-1940s, the United States, the Army intelligence, whatever the precursor to the NSA was, the National Security Agency, they had found a flaw in the Soviet code, and they were able to begin breaking the code and reading these cables. And nobody knew about this. Actually, Harry Truman, the president, didn't even know about this. This was completely top secret. And it was declassified 50 years after the end of the war, after the end of World War II. So in 1996, this project was declassified and made public to the people. And what it showed is that exactly what Joe McCarthy was saying was actually correct. There were communist Soviet spies all over the United States State Department, and they were in high-level positions. And as I read through this chapter on McCarthyism, and they go through him being censured by the United States Senate, they go through him accusing people of, being homosexual, they go through him, people losing their jobs. There's not a whole lot of, detail with that, but it's just, it paints him as somebody who is making these accusations and that they are completely baseless, as though there is nothing, nothing behind them whatsoever. Now, when I took United States history, it was 1992. Venona hadn't been declassified yet, so I have to give my teachers a pass. This, I looked at the copyright on the book, it's 2010. There's absolutely no excuse for it. I mean, it could at least come in at the end where they say, look, after the declassification of the Venona Project, and if anybody has never heard of this, I encourage you to just go look it up. I mean, this is actually interesting. This is a very important part of the United States history. If you're going to teach McCarthyism, you can't teach it without teaching the last chapter, which is the declassification of Venona, that this would be like teaching World War II and never mentioning Adolf Hitler. I mean, that's just what it would be a part of the story that you would have to teach. But anyway, in these declassified cables, and there were about 350 Americans in government positions that had some sort of connection to Soviet intelligence agencies. And some of them were just low-level staffers, but a number of them were extremely high-level government officials. And this is scary. These are Stalinists, people working for Joseph Stalin in the United States government. And the thing about McCarthy is, yeah, his tactics were probably ruthless, and the unconstitutionality of it is not okay. But he was right. He knew he was right. He just didn't know how he could prove it. Here are just a couple of the names that are of interest, and this is only a few of them. But Alger Hiss, he was a top State Department official. He was instrumental in the establishment of the United Nations. This isn't a low-level guy. Harry Dexter White, who was an economist, he was a senior official in the Treasury Department. He was actually the assistant to Morgenthau, who was the Treasury Secretary. He was instrumental in the creation of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank after the war ended. Lachlan Curry, an economic advisor to Franklin Roosevelt, who stayed on during the Truman administration. He was actually one of the key architects of the New Deal. He was a very important person on the economic side of FDR and Truman. Harry Hopkins, he was another New Deal architect. He was the Secretary of Commerce under FDR. He was actually known to be FDR's closest advisor. He was also at Yalta when half of Eastern Europe got handed over to a murderous dictator in Joseph Stalin. These were all confirmed to be Soviet spies by Venona. That matters. That is part of the story. And that's one of the things that just bugs me about the way U.S. history is taught. This was actually one of the first lessons in my, I guess what you would call my re-education when it came to U.S. history. I always learned things just the standard textbook. That's all I ever had. You have your high school textbook, then you go through college and you listen to your college professors. And then I decided I was going to go into teaching, and you grab another textbook, and that's where you kind of learn. And you imagine these textbooks to be just a dispassionate rendering of the facts. Of course, there's going to be people out there who have opinions and they dive into certain topics a little bit deeper, but you don't take the textbook to be that. But really it is. I mean, these authors, I went through and I looked up who the primary authors are here and the courses that they teach at the various universities. And they're like any other human. If you want to paint America to look a certain way, you can do that just by the way that you write. And so the fact that they wrote this entire chapter on Joe McCarthy and then never once mentioned the fact that the Venona cables actually, now there's some controversy, hardcore, deep left progressive or Marxist people say, well, no, it didn't vindicate him at all. And I'm not saying it vindicated his tactics, but what I am saying is that these major people in the State Department, this was his fear, and they also, one of the things that also bugs me, and this is, throughout this chapter, they throw in the HUAC, right? The House of Un-American Activities Committee. And they kind of lump that all in with McCarthy and the Hollywood blacklisting and stuff. Okay, the House Un-American Activities Committee, that was the House. That's a different chamber. This is Senator Joe McCarthy. Not only that, that began in, I think, the late 1930s. I think it was 1938 when that committee convened. That was 10 years before McCarthy was even voted into he had been in the war before he was even voted to become senator. I mean, so this had happened way before. It's not as though this was a complete non-issue, and then McCarthy showed up in the in the Senate, and then boom, it just exploded. No, this had been going on, and it had been going on, and those in Hollywood who had been blacklisted were blacklisted under the House before McCarthy was even in Congress at all. But it all gets, it kind of gets lumped into the same thing and then piled onto him. And then if you were to read only this textbook, you would think, well, he was just a lunatic. No, actually, he was right. There were subversive actors in the United States government at very, very high levels. And Justin, you might be shocked to hear this, but Franklin Roosevelt's economic advisors happen to be communists. The architects of the New Deal happen to be communists. Big surprise there, I'm sure. But that is the other side of McCarthyism that your textbook just isn't going to give you.
Yeah, that's really well said. And that is shocking. I know. And it does, as we leave the listeners here on our radio broadcast to maybe think and ponder over, I know something that we've been wrestling with, or at least I have been over the past week that I've been studying this is, and I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there with, do the ends justify the means? You know what I mean? And it's one of those things where I know I kind of laid out a presentation of, maybe what was going on in the Senate, with surrounding this. And as you talked about the HUAC and things of that nature, what are we to make of those things? How are they manifested into abuses of power that we still see going on today? Does that give, for example, in a modern term, since the NSA and everything, the TSA and all these other things that we use in terms of Homeland Security, the right to wiretap or pat you down going through the airport or whatever it might be, how those things have manifested today. But knowing that it was producing a positive outcome, how do we reconcile that? And that's something that you have to kind of think through and wrestle through. So,
I would say that the ends do not justify the means. But in this case, I think it's worth a mention what the, what I mean? Mm-hmm. What the end of the story was. And that's one of my biggest problems with this is there's so many things. You've talked about this with the government book too, where there are just straight omissions. And how is a student supposed to know? I mean, you don't know what you don't know, right? Because you've never heard it. So how would a student ever know and be able to actually just make up their mind on this without knowing the full story? It's frustrating.
Right. Absolutely. Well, those of you that are listening on WCVLAM.com or 1550-92.1, thank you for taking time this morning to be with us. We hope that you'll be able to tune in again with us next week, where we will once again, we're going to leave you in suspense. We're going to take on another historical topic, but we're going to make you tune back in next week before you can find out what exactly we'll be taking on. So thank you for being with us this week. For our YouTube listeners, we're going to hang on here just a little bit longer, but you have now heard the other side. Okay, welcome back. For those of you listening on mobile or YouTube, we are going to spend a couple of minutes here kind of debriefing and going over this, picking up a little bit with where we left off there at the end. And Mike, I'm glad that you said that there at the end about the ends not justifying the means, because I do think it's very easy with what we see today, with what our government is currently structured as, with being, Republican-led in the House, the Senate, and having the presidency right now, the executive branch, a lot of the neocons that are out there banging the drums for increased war powers, increased powers of the national and even at the local level too, I think, governments. We have to, guard these liberties jealously, as someone once famously said. And I think it is difficult, though, when you know that there are issues out there, and how you do that. I guess what I want to ask you is, was there much legitimacy to this, or was Russia just the boogeyman that after World War II ends, now all of a sudden it's like, oh, what is peace going to present to us? How are we gonna live, peacefully now? Is this just like we need one more thing to continue the war machine going, or what? Because we know Eisenhower delivers his famous industrial military complex in his farewell address. Is Russia just becoming the next thing, boogeyman out there, or was there legitimacy here to what was going on?
Well, I think that the boogeyman is a figment of your imagination. Stalin killed multiple tens of millions of people, and they were real people, and he was a real person, and that really happened. So I think you have to draw a distinction there, and you have to look at what was actually happening in Russia at the time. So in the 1930s, like if you want to look at what happened in Ukraine, for instance, I mean, this was a mass genocide, and the leftists in the country at the time, famed Pulitzer Prize winner Walter Duranty, who, wrote for the New York Times, which apparently was no different in the 1930s than it is today, he completely covered up this famine because it went against his narrative of what he said the Soviet Union was like under Stalin. He kind of famously went over there and said, I don't forget exactly what the phrase was, but something like, I've seen the future and it works, or you know what I'm talking about, something along those lines. But and again, that of course is never mentioned here in this book. But you have these famines, you have these purges, you have millions of people summarily executed just because they are either wealthy landowners or educated, and boom, dead like that. And now you have people in our government on their payroll. I don't think that that's a non-issue. I don't think that this can be overblown when you're looking at that type of evil. And it is evil when you talk about a guy like Stalin. I know some of his successors were, they were obviously much, much milder than he was, but operating under the same basic framework of communism. Of course, Stalin was on an island as far as murderous lunatics go. But using that as kind of a context, to have spies from him high up in places in our government, that's not okay. That would warrant a little bit of fear if I were in the Senate and I had reason to believe that there was some possible subversion on the horizon there. I would want to get to the bottom of it. Now, I do think that you always have to operate within the bounds of the Constitution, no matter what, because the ends justify the means. That was the communist tagline, right? That came from Marx. And so, no, that is not okay. But like I said, it is worth a mention that this was not, as it's portrayed here, as just wild-eyed lunacy that with nothing at the end of it, like it's just contrived, made up. It was actually true. What he said was happening was happening. He just couldn't prove it then. And that's an important piece of the story that our students never hear.
Yeah. And I guess, again, that's just the thing that I've been struggling with is, as I've gone through and studied this, and I was completely honest and upfront with the listeners in saying that I'm not overly well versed in this section of our history. And I really had to, sit down and read through a couple of hours worth of material, just background information. And obviously, like I said, I kind of honed in on a couple of articles here. But I still struggle with this even today, in thinking about the war on terror and, to what lengths are we going to give the federal government the authority and ability, you mentioned within the bounds of the Constitution, but how do we reconcile that? How do we look at a situation where, somebody like, well, let me just throw this one out there. Here's one that I was thinking about earlier this week. The tactics that we used for enhanced interrogation, right? Obviously you've got a segment of our population that were vehemently against that type of tactic. And then you've got others that are saying, hey, if it produces results and it gets, it saves lives, then, hey, they're terrorists. They're fighting an open war against this country. They're hostile, whatever you want to call it. All is fair. How do we reconcile that with getting the results that we want? You know what I mean? I guess the question I'm asking is, can you define where that line is of constitutionalism and things of that nature?
I would offer no constitutional protection for somebody who puts on a jihadist uniform, although they don't wear uniforms, and comes shooting at our country. So I would start there. But if we want to equate it to the war on terror, this would be like, you know, if Mohammed Atta's brother was the assistant to the Secretary of State. You know, I think that would be that would be a big deal. You know, and it
Well,
would
I
be.
know there were, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I know there were questions about Huma Aberdeen, who, if no one recognizes that name, is Anthony Weiner's ex-wife.
I was going to say, I think if you mention her husband, then people will know.
Yeah, the Anthony Weiner, he's probably more well known for his sexual misconduct, but I believe she has some ties to, oh gosh, the Muslim Brotherhood or Hamas, maybe some relatives that served or a part of their government. And so there were questions about that. And obviously she was leaked to the Hillary email issue. And so there were a lot of red flags there that kind of got, in my opinion, not enough face time with everything else that was going on. But yeah, I mean, certainly, the day and age in which we live in and the dissemination of information that we have today, obviously all the talks, even still today in 2018, about Russian hacking and things of this nature. Now it's, much more remote as opposed to infiltrating the system physically. There are claims that they can do it, through digital and cyberspace. Again, to what degree, should, for example, the federal government be involved with companies like Facebook and Apple and Google to be able to data mine or track or whatever? I guess there was a story, I haven't kept up with it, but there was a story about Zuckerberg and data being turned over, maybe, or
Correct.
something along those lines.
Yeah.
So those kinds of things.
I mean, no, I do not think. I've always been of the, idea that if they're listening to my calls, they're not going to hear anything all that interesting. So whatever. But no, I don't. I do not think that this is anything that the government should have access to. They should rely on. But we have a court system for that. We have a FISA court, where you have to come off. Of course, this thing is a joke now, from what we know about the dossier. Apparently, this is the Trump dossier or whatever, which was used to get a FISA court warrant to wiretap Trump or whatever. But there is at least there are institutions in place where if you have reasonable intelligence that somebody might be engaged in terrorist or subversive activity or something, that you can, then look to target that person individually. But no, yeah, like the widespread use of data mining, and from what I understand, they're just really looking at codes and for abnormalities in the code, and nobody is actually physically reading emails, and so that changes it too a little bit. But yeah, I mean, that we have constitutional safeguards which keep our emails and our Facebook messages and our texts and our phone calls private, and it needs to stay that way. Now, with that being said, if I get on the phone and I start talking to you, hey, Justin, God, I hope nobody's listening to this, I plan on blowing up the White House or something like that. The idea that the government would have no interest in listening in and trying to stop that is insane. Of course they would, and they should be able to. So it's, I don't have a black and white answer for you. I don't have a cut and dry answer.
No, it's hard. It is, and I think everybody has to have a threshold or worldview on it that they have to reconcile, how that goes about. I think the thing that really popped out to me as we start to wind this up in reviewing this was when I read through this New Republic article that they really chronicled and talked about the fact that these people that were called before these Senate committees and the House of Un-American Activities or whatever it was, that they essentially were forfeiting. I mean, the way that it is spelled out and the way in which these people were bullied, intimidated, harassed. I mean, they talked about, people losing their right to client privilege with their lawyers, the right to representation, the right to plead the fifth, the right to speak their mind in the committee without being ridiculed, harassed, bullied, intimidated. To me, that was really eye-opening. I mean, I had always kind of what you talked about, the standard line of McCarthyism being the witch hunt type strategy and tactics. But when I really read through it, I was like, wow, that obviously steps over the lines. I'm with you that, yeah, when you catch wind of something like a plot to assassinate or harm or do some kind of destruction, I want the government, because its primary function, I think, is to protect my life and liberty, to know about that. But I don't want them to have so much broad authority that they can go out and proactively, lead these, witch hunts, to be able, just because you politically don't agree with somebody, or it's politically expedient for you in your career to be able to show I'm tough on this. Look what I'm doing to
Right.
further your political career.
Well,
That's a hard thing to identify sometimes where that line in the sand is, but I think it's clear when you see it. You know what I mean?
no, you're right. And let's also keep in mind that the 40s and 50s were not a great time for civil liberties. If we want to look at the internment of the Japanese, and there was just there were not quite to the extent of the alien and sedition laws, but you had a lot of apparently Truman had, he had organized this process where you had to basically, you had to go through these loyalty checks if you were working for the government. This started in 1947. So yeah, there were a lot of questionable activities, and again, if the textbook took this entire era and said, here is how the federal government, if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. Here's an example of how they do that. I would have no problem with this whatsoever. But what I see this textbook is doing is, I see this as leftists covering for leftists and trying to point somebody who is calling out communists, trying to point at him and say, well, that was just a fool. Well, he was not a fool. He was right. They were all over the place in the FDR administration. And look, FDR's policies are communist. So it's that is part of the story that needs to be told, but that's not what these authors are doing.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a really good way of wrapping up what we have built this around. Is, our kids are being exposed to this, in many, many classrooms throughout the country. They're hearing this type of presentation of history and government and economics. And so we've made it our goal to at least try to spread the word, that there are alternative viewpoints here that need to be considered. And as I always say in the classroom, and I know you're co-signed on this too as well, Mike, is that, look, we're not here to tell you what to think. We're here to encourage you to think. And if you're only presented this one size fits all, or this one worldview of how history went down, that's not going to cut it, in our opinion. And so I think that's what we're trying to accomplish here with this. And so hopefully this episode has done that. Hopefully this episode has encouraged you to think a little bit about maybe a topic that you could recall back from your days in the U.S. history classroom, and what you know and thought you knew about McCarthy. And maybe you're going to go out and read a little bit more about it, and maybe come away with a little bit different perspective on this event. So again, we like to thank you for taking the time to be with us on this episode of The Other Side. Mike, what are you thinking about next week? Anything popping out to you right now?
Love to do the New Deal.
Oh, yeah. I think that would be a great piggyback off of this. You brought it up a couple of times, and, where did some of the roots of this come from? There is all kinds of misinformation out there in textbooks, omitted material. That might actually need to be a two-parter. We'll clean that one out and see how it goes as we start to lay that out. But that's going to be a fun episode. So until next week, you have now heard The Other Side.
Thanks for listening. And remember, you're not fully informed until you've heard The Other Side.